Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today we're going to be talking about what decks have the highest average win rate in the current new format in Pokemon TCG Pocket. Not only that, but we're going to be taking a look at the specific matchup datas for each of the archetypes, go a little bit deeper, and fully understand the positioning and I guess why some decks have higher average win rates than other decks. That's what we're going to be diving into today. Certainly going to be taking a look at some really cool deck lists, but at the same time, really just kind of diving into the data a little bit. So these videos might be a little bit tough to follow. I'll try to do my best. But anyway, we did make a video yesterday, so I apologize for that. But today, I wanted to dive into it. There's a lot of new decks at the top of the metagame, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily know what data they should be taking a look at. I think that this video should help quite a bit. Of course, when you're playing in tournaments, the metagame changes every week, and the meta shares and which decks are popular changes every week. And not only that, but when you're playing in ranked battles, whether you're in Great Ball, Ultra Ball, Master Ball, or High Master Ball tier, the decks that you're going to be going up against are likely different, right? So this data here is kind of universal based off of the fairly large sample size that we have so far. This is across the entire Extra Dimensional Crisis format in this last week or so. We've got about 40 tournaments, about 3,500 players, and almost 9,000 matches of data to be able to take a look at. So we're not going to go ahead and take a look at every deck in the format, but we're going to take a look at all of the most common decks of the format, see which decks have the highest average win rate, and then why they have such a high or low win rate. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe, guys. Hopefully this is, useful to you guys. Comment down below what you guys think. If anything surprises you in this video, I would love to hear it. And then stay tuned, because tomorrow we're going to be, I guess taking a look at what I believe are my top decks right now for ranked battles going into the second week of the format. All right, let's just do it, guys. Let's hop right in. So the first deck, of course, and right now we are on limitless.com and we are in the decks tab here, and we're just kind of looking at the overall metadata for this particular format so far. And right now the decks are filtered by the most popular decks. So right now we do see Silvally Rampardos, even though it is declining in play a little bit, started at about 20% early on in the format. It is now at about 14% of the meta share. Buzzwole and Pheromosa is the second most played deck at 10% meta share, but it does split Buzzwole up into two categories. So down here at number 6, we've got Buzzwole and Celesteela at 3.14% meta share. So realistically, Buzzwole is definitely very close to Silvally overall in terms of its meta share and how many people have played it. Giratina Darkrai here third, Shiinotic and Solgaleo is fourth, Charizard Incineroar is fifth, and then if we go down a little bit, this is really where things are much more spread out. This is where we get into sort of our fringe meta, but also kind of our tier 2 meta. A lot of these decks are actually quite phenomenal, and I think that eventually they're going to rise up to be, full-blown meta decks at one point or another. Of course, we've got both the Decidueye decks at 7th and 8th. We've got Giratina Magnezone at 9th, Charizard Silvally at 10th, Guzzlord at 11th, Dark Arceus at 12th, Charizard Turtonator at 13th, another Decidueye deck down at 14th, Arceus Crobat 15th, Garchomp, Guzzlord, and then all of the other stuff that's kind of in the metagame, but not really in the metagame. If we go down, there are some strong decks that maybe aren't necessarily seeing that much play yet, but I think could be certainly really good. So anyway, let's dive right into it. Silvally and Rampardos. Let me pull up just the most recent successful deck, or the most successful Rampardos Silvally deck. I think we all understand what this deck list is. I talked about it a little bit on Tuesday. I think that Silvally and Rampardos is a really, really strong deck, but I think that it's sort of the gatekeeper of the format. It is kind of the default deck list that I think people assume is perhaps the best deck in the metagame. If you're not really paying attention to a lot of the current trends, this is going to be kind of what people default to. It certainly is strong, and it has, of course, a very high average win rate. If we go back, Silvally Rampardos actually has a higher average win rate than every other deck in, I believe, the top 10 or top 15. So if you take a look at average win rates, and by the way, what you'll kind of get from this video is that average win rates aren't really the #1 statistic that you should be looking at. Sure, it is relevant against the entire format. Of course, that is your average win rate, but whether you're in High Master Ball tier or in tournaments, you're not always playing against every deck. You're most oftentimes playing against very particular decks at the top of the meta. But Silvally Rampardos, to be, of course, the #1 most played deck and have the highest win rate is very impressive. Of course, the more a deck sees play, the more it ends up playing itself in tournaments, which means the lower its win rate drops closely to 50%. So, that being said, Silvally Rampardos at 14% of the meta share at 55.5% win rate is certainly very, very impressive. Let's dive in a little bit and take a look at its matchups, and that might give us a more detailed understanding of where this deck is positioned in the current metagame. So as we see, Silvally Rampardos, again, about a 50% win rate, always against itself. That is its most common matchup. Makes sense. It's the most popular deck of the metagame. Like I said, impressive for it to have a 55% win rate, seeing this much play. If we go down here, we see that its matchup spreads against Buzzwole is a little bit, to be desired. Of course, 44% against Buzzwole Pheromosa. It is about a 49% in a smaller sample size against Buzzwole with Celesteela, that being mostly with Kartana. So that's interesting. Pheromosa definitely seems a bit better into the Silvally matchup than maybe not playing, 1 or 2 copies or no copies, I guess, of Pheromosa, which is interesting, right? Giratina Darkrai, about a 50-50 matchup here, 116 to 107. Again, these sample sizes aren't super massive yet, but can provide a lot of context to us. So about 50% against Giratina and Darkrai, which is interesting, but definitely struggling here against Shiinotic and Solgaleo. I think a big reason why Solgaleo has kind of risen up in popularity in the format is, of course, because it does quite well against a variety of different decks, that, of course, being Silvally, Rampardos, and Buzzwole, I believe. We'll take a look at that in a little bit. And like I said, does really well against Charizard, does pretty good against Charizard and Silvally, however, smaller sample size, definitely closer to 50%, and does very well against Decidueye, actually struggling a bit against Giratina and Magnezone, doing very well against Meowscarada. We've talked about that previously. Struggling a little bit, again, these are smaller sample sizes, so take them with a grain of salt, against Dark Arceus and against Guzzlord. Very good against Charizard Turtonator, for sure. Turtonator definitely gets bodied by Silvally. And then if we go down, what you'll notice, something very interesting about Silvally and Rampardos, is that I believe the majority of its wins come from all of the decks that we don't really consider meta decks, right? In tournaments and in Swiss rounds, you're going to end up facing a lot of decks that aren't really, real meta decks. They're kind of not particularly that good. Maybe they're really good against something specific, but what Rampardos and Silvally does is I think it really gatekeeps a lot of decks in the format. And if we go down, we see that all of these decks that really don't see that much play, Silvally and Rampardos has phenomenal matchup spreads and win rates against really all of these decks. So this is why I call this sort of the gatekeeper deck, and that's because it kind of struggles against some of the more common meta decks at the top of the metagame. Certainly there are counters to Silvally Rampardos, but kind of just tremendously mops the floor with all of the stuff that we don't really consider to be top of the meta, which is, I think, a big reason why the win rate has been boosted for Rampardos and Silvally. I think this positions this deck to be really good in maybe the lower tiers of Master Ball, where you're or not Master Ball, but ranked battles, whether you're in like Pokeball, Great Ball, maybe even low Ultra Ball tier, where you're playing a very random kind of variety of decks that maybe aren't meta decks. I think Silvally Rampardos is probably going to be still your best option for getting through some of those lower ranks. It's just very consistent and very, very strong, and the likelihood of you kind of consistently hitting a few of the top meta counters is going to be lower in the lower ranks. However, I think in like high Master Ball tier, or even in sort of mid to low Master Ball tier, Silvally and Rampardos gets a little bit worse. We kind of saw that translated at Ursa Days, and its day 2 conversion rate was really, really good, but its performance in day 2 was really quite bad, considering that it was mostly playing all of the other top most played decks of the format, which, again, as we saw here in the matchup spreads, it does kind of struggle against a variety of decks at the top of the meta. So in my mind, yeah, Silvally Rampardos is kind of the bad deck, destroyer is really what I'm kind of getting at here. Very high average win rate, but that's why we dive into the matchups there, so we get a kind of a full understanding of, what that average win rate really means. So definitely interesting. This video is going to be about talking about the decks with the highest average win rate, but also talking about the decks and their matchups, right? So that's definitely an important thing to get into. At the end of the video, what we'll do is we'll filter by win rate, and you get some really funky results there because decks with very small sample sizes end up just doing really well randomly. So it's really fun to take a look at that data, even though I wouldn't put too much stock into it. Next up, let's take a look at Buzzwole and Pheromosa, which is actually really quite high. 53% is the second most played deck of the format. Honestly, very respectable. It's just below Buzzwole and Celesteela, but certainly, relatively the same, especially with seeing more play. So yeah, let's take a look at the matchup spreads, or actually let's take a look, I suppose, at the highest placing deck. This deck got, I believe, second place at the Ursa Days this past weekend. Pheromosa and Buzzwole, I think, is in general the strongest way to play a Buzzwole, but I think that there's a lot of healing in the format. There's a lot of counterplay that people are kind of preemptively setting up for Pheromosa. The attack is extremely strong, 20 damage to the active and 20 to a bench Pokemon. Opens up a lot of scenarios for you to win games by playing Cyrus. It can feel a little bit strange. There are times where your win condition is playing Lusamine. I personally don't love playing 2 copies of Lusamine, but again, or 1 copy of Lusamine, I prefer 2. But again, this deck list is a little bit more about, kind of using that Buzzwole to kind of take a KO exactly where we want to. This deck list's kind of flow does get disrupted by healing cards, and of course, maybe some tool cards that buff HP like the capes. So it can be a little bit awkward for sure, but this is certainly a really, really strong deck. I don't really have too much else to say about Buzzwole Pheromosa. I think Buzzwole in the entire sort of grass Ultra Beast package is actually the best archetype in the game right now, whether you're playing it with 2 Pheromosa or 1 or 2 Kartana, whatever it ends up being. I do believe in general it's kind of the strongest deck of the format right now. You have answers to kind of everything, other than a couple of really high roll sort of mid-range decks that like to set up and kind of sweep. Anyway, let's take a look at the matchups for Buzzwole Pheromosa. Pretty good against Silvally Rampardos, as we saw, about 50% against itself. Pretty decent against Giratina and Darkrai, but then we see a couple of matchups where Buzzwole really struggles. And I think that's sort of the glaring weakness with Buzzwole, is that we struggle against Shiinotic and Solgaleo at about a 32% win rate, and then we struggle against Charizard decks, again, about a 32% win rate for Charizard and Incineroar. However, we just do really well against most of the other decks at the top of the meta. Against Buzzwole and Celesteela, a smaller sample size, but pretty good as well. So Pheromosa in the head-to-head seems to be pretty good at 58% win rate, which is kind of surprising to me. This is a small sample size, but in general, I do kind of feel like Kartana kind of favors you a little bit. But I think, honestly, it really comes down to, like, the second Cyrus can be really good. Playing Guzma, also just playing, 2 copies of Erica's will oftentimes win the mirror match. So definitely kind of interesting to see there. A little bit of a losing matchup actually against Decidueye, even though this is a small sample size. Everything from here on out is a pretty small sample, but doing pretty well against a lot of the other top decks. Again, struggling a bit against Charizard, and if we go down here, we're probably going to see, struggling against the other Charizard decks as well. So that's kind of what we're seeing with Buzzwole, which I think is very, very interesting. Everything else down there is maybe not as worth taking a look at in terms of the matchup spreads. Buzzwole and Pheromosa, and really all of the Buzzwole decks, are really good in the format against basically everything other than Charizard and Solgaleo, which are becoming a little bit more common, but those are decks that typically do lose to Oricorio. So if Oricorio ends up seeing a bit more play, Silvally Rampardos will maybe end up seeing more play, and then Solgaleo and Charizard will see less play, and then Buzzwole can kind of sweep in and be really well positioned. So what we're seeing, I think, at the top of the meta right now in this new format is sort of a 2 different or 3 different, I guess, sort of aspects of like a rock, paper, scissors, which is actually quite good. I honestly do believe there's about 10 to 12 decks at the top of this metagame that are all very viable and kind of worth playing. So here are the win rates and the matchup spreads for Buzzwole and Pheromosa. Certainly one of the best decks of the format. And if we take a look at Giratina and Darkrai, it's actually been rising in win rate, which is a little bit scary to me. The 3rd most played deck of the format, a little bit lower than the other decks at a 51.5% win rate, 8.5% of the meta share. Let's take a look at the matchup spreads, or let's take a look. I guess we'll just showcase the deck that won Ursa Days. This is going to be Disruption, Healing, Giratina, and Darkrai. This deck is so good because it's really consistent and flexible. We can play Healing, we can play a ton of Hand Disruption. As we see here, 1 copy of Mars, 2 copies of Red Card, 2 Pokemon Center Ladies, 1 Giant Cape, 1 Rocky Helmet. Just so much that this deck can do. Hand Disruption is very volatile in the format. Sometimes it wins you games, sometimes you just don't do anything with it, but it always has the potential to disrupt your opponent enough to where you can kind of win games. And I think Giratina and Darkrai really does that. Because we're running 2 EX Pokemon, and that's really it, your opponent's basically always going to take 2 prizes, and then you can Mars them down to 1. And that is, in general, really, really strong when you're playing Giratina and Darkrai. So, yeah. Anyway, Giratina and Darkrai is crazy. Let's take a look at the matchup spreads, because I think this could be fairly interesting. And what we see, I think, is actually quite interesting for Giratina and Darkrai. For a tournament, or I guess a deck that won the first Ursa Days tournament of this format, it actually struggles against a lot of the decks at the top of the metagame. So we were talking about that in Monday's meta report, that Giratina and Darkrai seemingly got a little bit lucky, but, that's certainly something that can happen in tournaments. As we see, about a 47% win rate against Silvally Rampardos, 40% against Buzzwole, about a 50% against itself, of course. A favorable matchup, actually, against Solgaleo and Shiinotic, and then a losing matchup again against this Buzzwole deck. It actually does well against Charizard. Again, the Hand Disruption probably going to be really good against the Stage 2 decks. A little bit of a struggle against Meowscarada and Decidueye, as always, but doing really well against Giratina and Magnezone. Doing good against Charizard Silvally, struggling against Dark Arceus, but doing well against Charizard Turtonator, struggling against Guzzlord, against Decidueye, against Garchomp. So there's a lot of popular decks in the format. And of course, if we go down, all of the Oricorio decks are probably going to struggle 90% against Solgaleo Skarmory. Actually, a 6-2-2 matchup against Magnezone and Oricorio is kind of crazy, but 20% against Greninja Oricorio. And if we go down here, there's Silvally, Zeraora. It's actually a winning matchup. There is quite interesting. 1-5, though, against Silvally Oricorio, which is something that's becoming a little bit more common. So Giratina and Darkrai is actually not that well positioned in my mind. I think it's a deck that can always win, so you have that upside. It has a very low, or I should say, a really high downside, where it's always somewhat consistent, so it's always going to do kind of what it wants to do. to some degree, even though it is going to struggle inherently against some of the other top decks of the format, but kind of struggling. I mean, its matchups against a lot of the most common decks of the format realistically isn't that good. So it's kind of crazy to me. I don't think that Giratina and Darkrai is like a really strong contender in this format, but I don't think it's terrible. I just don't necessarily believe in it that much. It's not something I would really decide to bring into grinding up into like high Master Ball tier. And that's just kind of my opinion. But either way, Giratina and Darkrai is rising in not only popularity in this format, but in win rate, which is a bit scary. I think after the first weekend, it only had about a 48 or 49% win rate. So it is going up, whereas most of the other decks are kind of going down. Things are kind of falling towards 50-50. So yeah, that's kind of how it goes. Next up, let's take a look at Solgaleo and Shiinotic. This is a really interesting deck that has, I think, really specific good matchups at the top of the metagame. Let's take a look at the deck list real quick. I'm going to take a drink. All right, so Solgaleo and Shiinotic, man. I call this kind of like the solitaire deck of the format. Charizard's always like that for sure. Solgaleo and Charizard are definitely both the two decks where it doesn't really matter kind of what you're going up against. You're going to be playing the decks the same way either way. Solgaleo can be really strong, or it can do literally nothing, and it doesn't really matter. You just kind of do the same thing every game. But anyway, Solgaleo and Shiinotic is really interesting. It's fun to see at least Solgaleo and Shiinotic see play now. Those were, of course, Shiinotic's a new card, but Solgaleo saw it play last format, but did not see a lot of success. So it's cool to see Solgaleo as a good Pokemon and a good card in this format. The copy of Lilies, if you draw it early and if you get into Solgaleo early, is really where this deck becomes really tough to deal with, just because, you know, it snowballs with Shiinotic and pulling all of the Pokemon out of your deck. There becomes a time where in the late game, if your opponent isn't really fast-paced or can KO your Solgaleo, you're kind of blazing through your deck. There's been times where I'm like -10, -12, sometimes card advantage against Solgaleo, which feels really bad to be like turn 3 and for them to have 4 cards in their deck. If they draw into like double research and they get double Shiinotic set up, it really does feel like a deck that just snowballs out of control sometimes. Let's take a look at the matchups. And I think it's going to be, again, really, really interesting to see what these decks are good against. Fairly decent against Silvally and Rampardos. However, I don't even think that it's that good of a matchup. However, having a winning matchup against the two most popular decks of the format is definitely pretty relevant. Very, very good against Buzzwole and Pheromosa. Again, I do think that the high HP with Solgaleo and the copy of Lilies does kind of make that matchup really difficult for Buzzwole. And a lot less good against Buzzwole and Celesteela, even though that's a smaller sample size there at 16 and 12. And as we see, losing against Giratina Darkrai, about 50% against itself, losing to Charizard in both respects, whether that's Silvally or Incineroar, and then losing, of course, to Dark Arceus, and then losing to Guzzlord, losing to Blacephalon, losing to a lot of decks that aren't necessarily at like the top of the meta. Very, very bad against Oricorio, as we see here, 11% and 18%. So Oricorio, definitely a hard counter to Solgaleo. We don't really have an attacking option besides Solgaleo. I've seen some people tech in Magearna for their list. In fact, we might even be able to see or find a deck that plays Magearna. Although I think it's pretty niche. I don't know if it's going to like pop up on here. We can maybe try to find it. Is it this one? No. Okay, I don't know if I can really find it. Is it this one? No. Okay, yeah, I can't find it. But sometimes they play Magearna in their list, which is kind of interesting, basically just for the Oricorio matchup. But yeah, Solgaleo and Shiinotic is a very, very volatile deck. A deck that is really good against, again, the two most popular decks of the format. And of course, if these are the decks that are becoming the most popular, or these are the decks that you see most often in Master Ball rank, then maybe Solgaleo is the deck for you. But certainly not very good against the entire field. Although if we go down, there are some good matchups for sure. Blacephalon is pretty good. Guzzlord is pretty good. Dark Arceus is pretty good. So it's interesting, right? Definitely kind of an interesting scenario here for Solgaleo and Shiinotic, but you're going to struggle against Oricorio and you're going to struggle against Charizard. I think that's really where Solgaleo kind of fits in. Really dominant and interesting in terms of like the scenarios and where I think Solgaleo is good. I think that Solgaleo is kind of a sleeper pick, honestly, to win a tournament this format. I think it's popular enough, and I think it just does well enough against particular decks where if it does get a little bit lucky in day 2, it certainly could go ahead and get the W. Next up, we're going to skip over Charizard and Incineroar. However, as we see, the average win rate is quite low at 48%, so that's pretty tough. Buzzwole and Celesteela is a really, really decent one. Here's an example of Buzzwole Celesteela playing, of course, not 2 copies of Pheromosa, but 2 copies of Kartana. Maybe you're playing 1 and 1, but either way, as long as you're not playing 2 copies of Pheromosa, it probably is just categorized as a different deck. But yeah, here's an example of it. Really, really strong. I have been playing Buzzwole with Kartana, but I do think that depending on how the metagame shifts, Pheromosa could be certainly pretty better, especially like in high Master Ball tier. We'll have to see. And the matchup spreads are going to be quite interesting as well, as we see pretty even matchup against Silvally Rampardos, however, not super great. Struggling against Buzzwole Pheromosa. These are pretty small sample sizes, but anyway. Good against Giratina Darkrai, struggling against Solgaleo Shiinotic, struggling against Charizard, but just really, really good against mostly all of the other decks of the format, especially, in this range, right? Like Decidueye, Giratina and Magnezone, like Guzzlord, Dark Arceus, Arceus Crobat. A lot of the stuff Buzzwole is just really, really, really strong into. So I know that the sort of archetype of Buzzwole has been kind of split up into two, but I think if you were to kind of combine them both into just one archetype, you would see that Buzzwole is pretty good against basically everything in the format other than, of course, Solgaleo and Charizard. So it's kind of like the anti-version of like Solgaleo and Charizard, where it's like, it's something that I think is definitely worth playing, and I think as the meta sort of really evens out and we see a lot more Oricorio, or we see a lot more of these dark decks kind of crop up, I think that Buzzwole will kind of remain as a really strong option, since it is, again, somewhat favorable, at least if you're playing Pheromosa into Silvally and Rampardos, which is interesting. I think that this particular categorization on Limitless is a bit flawed, because it doesn't account for, I think, a lot of decks that are maybe not playing any Pheromosa, but I think as we saw in the most common version and the most common two versions, they're playing 2 Kartana and 1 Pheromosa, right? So 2 copies of Lusamine as well. There's a lot of different ways that we can play Buzzwole, but I'm sure if we go down quite a bit, like this is playing 1 and 1. So really, it's just like every deck that's not playing 2 Pheromosa. It doesn't account for decks that are maybe playing 2 Kartana and no Pheromosa, right? Which I'm sure there are kind of some of those. But anyway, yeah, Buzzwole Celesteela right there, pretty high up, 54% win rate as well. So yeah, we're definitely in a format right now where like the most common decks are certainly the strongest decks, right? That's more of a correlation than a causation, but there's certainly a little bit of both going on. If a deck is strong, people are going to play it, and if people play it enough, then it probably means it's strong, right? So that's kind of how it kind of boils down a little bit. Now let's scroll down a little bit and find some sleepers in terms of average win rates, which is always kind of fun to do. Some decks that are really not that popular and we don't have a large sample size still do really well and have been doing well. Maybe they're just new and there haven't been, of course there hasn't been like an Ursa Days tournament yet, but this weekend they might see a lot more play. Decks that are kind of sleeper picks, at least right now, things that aren't super common, but are definitely pretty strong. Dark Arceus is still one of those decks where I think it's always going to have a high win rate because it's not really matchup dependent that much. This is a deck that just always sort of wins a lot. Dark Arceus is just a crazy deck. It really is sort of like the Infinity Stones, like Exodia deck. If you get everything set up, you're just kind of KOing everything in your path. The Giratina Arceus lead with Dawn is kind of crazy as well. There have been times where I get hit with 130 damage Ultimate Force on turn 2, which feels a bit crazy, I'm not going to lie. But anyway, yeah, Arceus and Giratina and, with Dark Energies is definitely quite strong. Pretty fun deck list. If we take a look at the matchups here, small sample sizes across the board, so not much we can really pull from it. Struggling a bit against Buzzwole and Solgaleo, but probably pretty decent against basically everything else, which is pretty interesting for sure. And then what else is going to be kind of a high win rate that's not seeing a ton of play in these small sample sizes? Guzzlord and Naganadel is actually kind of floating around a pretty decent win rate here at 52%. All of these things in the middle, though, are quite low, like Arceus Crobat, Garchomp, Decidueye, Turtonator, and other Decidueye decks up here. Meowscarada is very low. Charizard and Incineroar. These are the kind of standouts to me that are really just not, even though they see a little bit of play, or at least they have early on in this format, I don't think that we should be taking them that seriously in terms of how viable they are in the metagame. But if we go down a little bit, we see that Silvally and Zeraora, which does play Oricorio as well, pretty decent. Again, smaller sample sizes down here, but 85 and 68, that's a 55.5% win rate so far, which is definitely pretty good. Guzzlord and Celesteela is interesting. This is not going to be like with anything. It's just like one copy of Nihilego. Again, Limitless categorizes it differently, but Guzzlord decks all consistently have pretty good win rates, which is kind of interesting to take a look at for sure. As we see, so 50% here, 52% here, and then, of course, 54% down here, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so Silvally and Oricorio also fairly decent at 51%, very similar to Silvally and Zeraora. Just depends on whether you're playing 1 Zeraora or 2 Oricorios, things like that. And if we go down here, Gallade Stoutland, kind of crazy here. Again, super small, 58 and 41, but in the small amount of games that it's seen play, has kind of the highest win rate out of anything here, 58%, which is kind of funny. A big reason why I put it on the tier list. It also has some decent placements right now. And if we keep going down, we might find some more surprising stuff. Incineroar and Turtonator, this is definitely an interesting one at 54%. Magnezone and Tapu Koko at 55%. That's also kind of an interesting thing to take a look at. And yeah, if we go down here, Darkrai and Naganadel. This is kind of a sleeper pick as well that basically nobody's playing, but has gone 29 and 18 so far, which is kind of cool. Let's take a look at the deck lists, mainly because this player probably went 6-0. But yeah, this is going to be Darkrai with Nihilego and then Naganadel. So I actually do kind of like this deck. It's about kind of doing really early damage with Poison, kind of relying on getting that Naganadel out early and then kind of using Darkrai as sort of your backup attacker while also kind of dealing that additional damage. It's a really, really fun deck. I think it has potential. Unfortunately, you probably do get bodied by Buzzwole, but other than that, certainly a strong archetype, maybe deserves to see more play. And if we go down a little bit, Tapu Koko and Oricorio, pretty decent here at 53%. Tapu Koko and Zeraora here at 57%. Very small sample sizes, so, take about that what you will. Now, let's quickly, to wrap up this video, let's filter by the win rates, because this is going to be kind of an interesting scenario here, which, again, it's going to filter by decks that have small sample sizes, so the data isn't something to really, put too much weight into, but it is always fun to do. Let's go ahead, filter by the highest win rate. And as we see here, yeah, some really silly stuff. So these are the decks that just never done anything, but Mewtwo EX, like this particular deck was played once and went 7-0. So this is literally Mewtwo EX with 19 trainers. Like that's the funny thing about this, right? I don't even know what tournament this was, but he went 7-0, which is hilarious. 39 players. It's a 19 trainer tournament. So there you go. That would kind of make sense, right? Why it was 7-0. That's just funny though, for sure. Crobat and Darkrai went 7-2. A couple players played it. Right here, it was first in an 18-player tournament, 17th in a 41-player tournament. This is kind of the scenarios where we're looking at, right? This is just Dark Arceus with no Giratina. So, there's... Wait, was that... Hold on. Was this... Oh, no, that's Judy. I thought that's a Jody. I was like, what the heck? Rayquaza and Stoutland went 3-1, so 75% win rate. This is the type of stuff that we see here. But what we can do is, I guess, scroll down to find stuff that is like somewhat highly played. Like right here, Darkrai and Naganadel at 51, at the 51st most played deck here at 61%. If we go down here, Stoutland Gallade at the 29th most played deck, 58%. All of the decks that are going to be high up here are just decks that basically nobody played. Only 1 or 2 people played them, and they did well in like a small tournament. But yeah, as we see, so Silvally Rampardos definitely just kind of doing good. Buzzwole right here. So yeah, it's interesting. It's always fun to take a look at this type of stuff, even though, it's not really something to put any stock into. But yeah, there it is, guys. There are the highest win rate decks of the format and kind of the landscape, I suppose, in terms of the win rates and how things are going right now in terms of like the most popular decks in Pokemon Pocket, as well as, the decks with the highest win rate. So I do think that we're in a pretty balanced metagame right now. Hopefully this video was somewhat interesting to you guys. I know the matchup data might be interesting, but Limitless does kind of split up some archetypes in awkward ways, which makes it a little bit difficult to quantify. But yeah, if I had to really boil it down, I would say that Silvally and Rampardos is the deck that is, of course, seeing the most play. It kind of dominates all of the really bad decks because it's consistent and it's good, but there are really strong counters to it at the top of the meta. That, of course, being Buzzwole and Solgaleo. Buzzwole, in general, in my mind, is the top deck of the format. However, there are a few decks that do pretty well against it, Solgaleo and Charizard, but these are deck lists that kind of struggle and kind of auto-lose against Oricorio, and they have their own bad matchups for sure, which kind of puts Buzzwole, I think, in a pretty decent position as long as Oricorio keeps some of these decks in check, which it's kind of supposed to do, right? Theoretically speaking, a deck like Shiinotic and Charizard are really, really strong decks, but that's because they're not sort of accounting or I guess sort of making their deck worse in a way to account for, Oricorio. You know what I mean? So if Oricorio becomes popular, these decks become much less good. Buzzwole becomes better. I think in general, Buzzwole is just a really, really strong deck. In my mind, the best deck of the format, but that might change given the results at the Ursa Days tournament. We'll have to see. Giratina and Darkrai is a really, really strange deck that doesn't have like terrible matchups against really everything in the format. It always has a chance to win, but not something I really deem super great against the top of the metagame. Solgaleo, kind of a counter to Buzzwole and Silvally, but again, you lose to Charizard, you lose to Oricorio. Charizard, really, really good against Buzzwole and Solgaleo, but again, you lose to Darkrai and Hand Disruption, and you lose to Oricorio. Pretty interesting as well. Some of these sleeper decks down here that see less play, I think have a lot of potential. I think Giratina Magnezone is still a really quality deck. I think Charizard Silvally is definitely a really, really quality deck. This is a list that I think a lot of people are just in general kind of sleeping on right now. I think it can kind of do everything. Charizard does, of course, have the potential to just win matchups, but we do have a copy of Silvally to kind of roll through Oricorio if need be, and I think that's really where that Silvally kind of comes in, and I think that it's kind of just worth playing. If I was going to play Charizard, that's how I would play it. I think that the Guzzler decks are all actually pretty decent as well. Dark Arceus is certainly really good. Decidueye is certainly something that I think is a little bit underwhelming, as well as some of the Oricorio decks. Meowscarada is certainly not something I would be playing right now for sure. Yeah, there it is. There it is, guys. There are all of the decks in the current metagame right now so far. Their highest win rates, their matchup spreads, everything like that. I typically make these videos in the second week of the format to give everybody at least a somewhat decent understanding of how things are kind of going right now. And, you know, I think a lot of people maybe don't fully understand, you know, what decks are good in certain matchups. And, you know, a video like this hopefully helps people determine what they believe is a good choice given the decks that are seeing most often play in the metagame, whether you're in Ultra Ball tier or Master Ball tier, or you're looking to play tournaments. That's certainly something to keep in mind for sure. So anyway, guys, there's the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Stay tuned tomorrow. We're going to be going over what I believe are the best decks for ranked battles in this upcoming week. So stay tuned for that. And then, of course, we have the Ursa Days tournament this weekend. We'll probably go live on Saturday or Sunday night to play some gameplay. Should be definitely pretty fun, and I'm really, really excited about it. So yeah, comment down below what you think of this metagame, what you think of the balance, what decks are you playing, and what kind of surprised you in terms of this data. I would love to hear your guys' opinions. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, guys, there it is. Yep. Okay. All right. Peace out, guys. Have a good one. Bye.